A hand clamped over Alice Donovan's mouth before she could finish the first scream. She had just stepped away from the entrance of the Walmart in Conway, South Carolina, pushing her cart toward her car. She was 44, a mother, a woman with routines and responsibilities waiting at home in Gallivant's Ferry. She had people who expected her back, kids who would watch the clock, family who knew her habits, friends who could tell you what kind of coffee she liked and which roads she avoided at night. In the time it took to fumble for her keys, 2 men came out of the parking lot like they belonged there. One grabbed her from behind. The other took the cart, shoving it aside. To anyone glancing over, it could have looked like an argument, an ugly family moment, something people convince themselves is none of their business. But then Alice's feet left the pavement, and she was forced into a blue BMW. The car pulled out fast. A few witnesses stood frozen, trying to understand what they had seen. By the time someone called for help, the BMW was gone, and Alice Donovan had vanished into the night. The men inside the car were not locals. They were not strangers to violence either. 10 days earlier, they had escaped from the Hopkins County Jail in Madisonville, Kentucky, slipping out as cellmates and heading south. Their names were Chadrick Folks and Brandon Basham, and from the moment they got free, they moved like men who believed they had already burned their lives down and had nothing left to lose. After the abduction, the search for Alice began immediately. Her family and friends clung to the hope that she was still alive somewhere, that the kidnapping was a carjacking gone wrong, and she would be found abandoned, shaken, but breathing. Law enforcement flooded the area, pushed out alerts, and took statements from shoppers who had been just a few rows away when she was taken. The blue BMW became its own lead, a description repeated over radios and on television as the case spread beyond Horry County. The FBI joined in as the case crossed state lines, and what started as a local panic became a national manhunt. Not long after she was taken, Alice managed to reach her family by phone. It was brief, the kind of call that raises hope and dread at the same time. Then the line went dead, and she was never heard from again. Investigators tracked every scrap of movement they could. Her bank card was used in North Carolina, proof that the men were traveling and that Alice's life was being treated like a resource to drain. Tips poured in from across the Carolinas as people watched the story unfold and began looking twice at every unfamiliar car in every parking lot. Search teams combed wooded areas and back roads. Helicopters swept over stretches of brush and swamp where someone could be hidden and never seen from the highway. Every hour that passed without a sighting tightened the fear that the men running with her were willing to do anything to stay free. Folks in Basham didn't stay in one place. They kept moving, driving, and hiding, feeding off the speed of the road and the belief that every mile put more distance between them and accountability. Their escape had already turned into a multi-state spree, and the evidence kept stacking up. Stolen cars, threats, violence, the sense of 2 fugitives improvising as they went. Their flight ended within days, but it ended far too late for Alice Donovan. Basham was arrested first, captured in Kentucky after the run caught up to him. Folks was taken into custody in Indiana. The arrests brought a rush of relief and fury, but they did not bring Alice home. Prosecutors would later describe her as a victim, taken at random, chosen not because of anything she did wrong, but because she was there, alone for a moment, in the path of 2 fugitives who were looking for the next thing to steal. When the legal process began to grind forward, the facts that emerged were brutal. Alice had been kidnapped and killed. The prosecutions treated the crime as shared responsibility, arguing that the men acted together from the moment they grabbed her to the moment they made sure she could not identify them. Court records and later appellate decisions would repeatedly return to the same core truth. But for the actions of these 2 men, Alice Donovan would be alive. Years passed, and the hardest part for Alice's family was the not knowing. Convictions and a death sentence did not bring her home. Without her remains, there was no place to put the grief down, no physical truth to confront, only a terrible absence. They searched. Volunteers searched. The story of her disappearance stayed alive in the community because it had happened in a place that was supposed to feel ordinary and safe. A parking lot, a shopping trip, a short walk to a car. Then, long after the crime itself, a new lead cracked open what had been sealed. Monica Cason, the founder of Community United Effort, wrote to Folks, pressing him to tell the truth about where Alice had been left. Folks responded with information that pointed investigators toward a wooded area in Horry County. In early 2009, search teams went in. Not far off a road, in a place that did not look remarkable to a passerby, they found human remains. DNA testing later confirmed what Alice's family had feared for years. The remains were Alice Donovan's. The bones had been recovered months earlier, in January, by investigators working a lead in the thick growth near Water Tower Road. For a long time, the remains were just that, remains, until science could give them a name. The samples were sent for specialized testing, and the confirmation came back in July. It was Alice. After years of flyers, phone calls, and people saying they were still looking, there was finally certainty. It was the kind of certainty that breaks you, and also the kind that lets a family breathe for the first time in years, because at least the waiting is over and the searching can stop. The discovery did not soften what happened. If anything, it sharpened it. Alice had not simply disappeared. She had been taken from her life with violence, carried away by two men who treated her like an obstacle in their escape. The documentation of the case was extensive: confessions, shifting stories, courtroom testimony, and the cold, methodical language of sentencing that tried to describe an unthinkable loss. The evidence painted a picture of predation and panic, of fugitives who kept escalating because escalation was the only way they believed they could survive the next day. In the end, Folks and Basham were convicted and sentenced to death in connection with Alice Donovan's kidnapping and murder. The courtroom record preserved their words, the arguments, the attempts to blame one another, and the admissions that circled the same reality. But none of it changed the simplest fact the people who loved Alice carried every day. She had walked out of a store expecting to go home, and instead she was pulled into someone else's violence and never returned. For the town, the case became a warning that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it steps out from between parked cars and steals an ordinary person in broad view. For Alice's family, it became a lifelong wound marked by one relentless question: how a normal moment could be broken so completely, so fast. Thank you for listening to The Lantern's Tale. Subscribe for more true stories, if you dare.